Welcome back, everyone. Thanks again for attending the webinar series. I think just give everybody a minute or two to get in the room. I'm hoping most of you were not too scathed from all the wet weather. I know it's heavily impacted some communities, and I know a lot of us have been out trying to help. And it's too bad after such a wet year to have to deal with it again, but maybe that's it. Maybe we're just looking forward to what next season will bring now. Hopefully not the same thing as this year. But anyway, all right, so we have today's webinar and tomorrow's wrap-up webinar, and that will conclude the Managing Neonicotinoids in Row Crop webinar series. But it certainly will not conclude our efforts in this area. And really, that's what we want to focus on tomorrow, is really getting feedback from folks, understanding concerns, needs, and questions that people have. And I'll be joined again by Steve Dwinell from the Agency of Agriculture so that we can hear from all of you. And again, just start marching towards, some solutions and some action items that we can work on to reduce neonic risks and movement. So just want to thank quickly our sponsors. So both the University of Vermont Extension, Northwest Crops and Soils program, and the Agency of Ag has been working to provide more education in this topic area and also developing research, which we'll hear a little bit about tomorrow. And the USDA Crop Protection and Pest Management Program, as well as the EPA Pesticide Environmental Stewardship Program. So just want to thank them for their support. And again, one more webinar tomorrow that will wrap up the series and hopefully help inform our future work in this topic area. So please make sure you come back tomorrow. And then don't forget CCA credits at the end of the webinar. The QR code will be posted. And if you need pesticide applicator credits, please email Susan either in the chat, send her a message, or you can email her directly. All right. So with that, I want to welcome Reed Johnson from The Ohio State University. And I've heard it's really important to say the Ohio State University. Is that true?
I don't care.
You don't care. I've been corrected before, so now I'm very really into, doing that. But I've never personally met Reed. Today was the first time that I met him, but I feel like I know him really well because our team has pored over that book of a research report that was put out a number of years ago that Reed was a major part of, looking at avenues, different practices and strategies to reduce bee exposure to insecticidal corn seed treatment dust. And it's a great report. There hasn't been a lot of work done on that area. And it's been really important to us here as we try to understand better what's happening out in the field and where can we minimize risk. So I don't know how to thank you for all that work, Reed, but we did hunt him down, found out where he was, bugged him a few times to get on this webinar series and talk to us about this work and his observations and where he thinks, things are heading. So thank you so much, Reed. We really appreciate your time today.
No, it's great to be here, Heather, and glad to share this. A few years since I've really talked about this, so I'm glad somebody's looking at that report. It was a lot of work in there, and I'm thrilled to be able to share it with everyone today.
All right, well, I'm going to stop sharing and I will turn it over to you then.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yep, it looks great.
Just a minute here. All right. So I guess I'm going to start off maybe a step back, which is why keep bees in agricultural areas in the first place, where they could be exposed to this insecticidal corn seed treatment dust. Because at first glance, agricultural areas seem to be a very poor place to maybe keep bees. And when I'm originally from Montana, so I didn't have a whole lot of experience with this kind of environment with, the corn and soybean that's grown here in Ohio. And I guess I had always kind of assumed that these agricultural areas would, there's certainly in the early spring, there's not a whole lot growing out there. So my assumption had always been that they were relatively poor places to keep bees. But I got into this because a former graduate student, Doug Sponsler, who graduated with his PhD a number of years ago now, was really interested in the effects of the landscape on the success of honeybee colonies. And he did a really nice study back in 2012 and 2013, where he involved beekeepers from all across Ohio. We worked with the Ohio State Beekeepers Association to find 50 beekeepers managing 50 apiaries in really diverse environments across the state. And those are all these stars that you see here are apiaries that were included in this study. And this is on top of the National Land Cover Database map from 2006, and it's color coded with forested land or urban land first here in red. Here in the middle of the state is Columbus, and you can see it's bright red. Ohio is a fairly urban state with, Cleveland, Toledo, Cincinnati, and Dayton. So we have quite a bit of urban land. And Doug was really interested in the success of bees in urban environments, because at the time, 2012, 2013, there was a lot of beekeeping had just been legalized in New York City. And there was this kind of widespread assumption that bees would be doing better in these urban environments than in the agricultural environments. And I supported Doug in his this project to find out whether those urban environments actually were better. Ohio also has a lot of forested land, probably much like Vermont, and that's in green on this map. The whole southeast of Ohio is pretty much in forest. And then we've got large amount of agricultural land, and this is corn and soybeans in the northwestern and western part of the state. And so we have got a pretty good representation of all the different land cover types in this survey working with these 50 beekeepers. And the way this study worked is we had beekeepers were installing new packages of bees in their apiaries. And a package, if you're not a beekeeper, this is how they come. They have about 10,000 worker bees in here and a queen. They're relatively standardized. I mean, a package is a package pretty much the world over. They're the same. And so the growth of the colony started from this package, and the development will really be dictated by the landscape that this package is placed into. And if it's a really good environment, they should make lots of honey and grow really well. If it's a relatively poor environment, they should make less honey and not do as well. And that's really what we asked beekeepers to look at. They filled out 2 surveys following the installation of this package in these different environments. And they reported on how much honey these different colonies made, as well as a number of other measures of colony success. And then Doug did statistical analysis on the results, primarily on the honey produced by these colonies. And he compared urban land to more rural land, whether that's forest or cropland, as well as between different types of rural land, whether forest or cropland. And here are the results. You can go read this in the journal Peer J if you're really interested in learning more about this study. But we have cropland. So we've got the few accumulation on the y-axis here. This is frames of honey that were present in September in these colonies started from packages. And then on the x-axis, we have this landscape gradient from cropland to forest. And what we found is that bees actually do significantly better with more cropland around them than they do with forest around them, which was kind of surprising. We had always assumed that forest would be a better environment for bees in Ohio, but it turned out cropland was superior. And then the question of whether urban land, which was the big hypothesis out there at the time, that urban bees would be doing better than agricultural bees, that was not supported by the data that we collected. They actually did better, again, in cropland than they did in more urban environments. And this really led us to wonder, well, what is it about this cropland that's making bees do so well? And this is a line of research that we're continuing really to this day to try to figure out and how to best support bees in the premier beekeeping environment in the state of Ohio, and that would be cropland. So the issue, though, is that there are a lot of pesticides used in agricultural crops. Of course, there are pesticides used really many places in the modern environment, but they, I guess, are a lot of pesticides used in agricultural environments, and particularly back in 2013, there were these growing problems with bee deaths related to corn planting. And so here we've got a picture of a corn planter going through the field. Not much going on in this field that would be attractive to bees, but along the edge here, we've got abundant dandelions, and we've got a row of trees back here in the distance. And it certainly could be that there's some insecticide being released as those corn seeds are being planted into this field. And so just to take a closer look at what we're talking about with these corn seed treatments, here's an image of a treated corn seed. Corn seeds are not naturally green like this. That is that seed treatment that's been applied to the surface of the corn seed. And that seed treatment can contain a number of different compounds. It does definitely contain insecticides, but it can also contain fungicides, microbial inoculants, plant growth regulators, and fertilizers. And particularly with the insecticides, these are generally the neonicotinoid insecticides on these seed treatments. And these have a systemic activity so that insecticide will dissolve off the surface of the seed and can get taken up by that young plant through the roots and can protect that young plant from insect feeding from the inside. Seed treatments are a huge market. This was, I just found this today. It's currently, or in 2022, it was a $13.4 billion market worldwide. And many different crops receive seed treatments, though corn, presented here in the dark purple, is one of the major crops receiving this seed treatment prior to planting. So corn, these are figures from the CropLife America, the trade association for the pesticide manufacturers. And in this was back in 2011, they estimated that 90% of the corn seed planted in the United States receives a seed treatment. And I don't think that number has decreased at all since then. It's probably actually greater than 90% today of corn that is treated with an insecticide or some sort of seed treatment, including these neonicotinoid insecticides. In fact, I've been told by fellow researchers and fellow entomologists that it can actually be quite difficult to purchase corn seed without this seed treatment because it's just so pervasive and essentially ubiquitous in corn production in this country right now. So in corn and soybeans, it could be really any of three neonicotinoids: clothianidin, thiamethoxam, and imidacloprid. Imidacloprid is primarily used in soybeans. It's clothianidin and thiamethoxam, two closely related compounds that are used in corn seed treatment. And these are under they have a number of label names, but they could be under the trade name Poncho or Cruiser. Thiamethoxam and clothianidin, interestingly, are actually essentially the same molecule. One of them breaks down into the other one, so they're essentially the same active ingredient. What these all share is that they are exquisitely toxic to bees. I mean, they're very good insecticides. They do what they're supposed to do in that they are very selective for killing insects. Unfortunately, bees are also insects, and they don't have selectivity against bees. So bees can be poisoned at very, very low doses with these neonicotinoid insecticides. I don't think that's news to anyone. It's pretty widely known that neonicotinoids are famously toxic to bees, but they're also toxic to pretty much all insects. And if you look at the map for where these insecticides are applied, and you can get these maps and graphs from the United States Geological Survey from their pesticide use project. They will produce both a map for, this is clothianidin use, this is from 2014, and you can see that The entire Midwest is this dark color indicating very high usage of this particular insecticide, clothianidin. And if you want to know what crop that's applied to, they have that broken down over here on the right in estimated use of in millions of pounds. And you can see that in 2014, the vast majority of the clothianidin applied was in this yellow bar, and that corresponds to corn. So most of the clothianidin applied is to corn and as a corn seed treatment. Now you may be asking, well, it appears that corn seed treatment is no longer receiving clothianidin starting in 2015. But that's not actually true. They actually quit asking about seed treatment usage because they really couldn't get good data, because many farmers don't even know that they are applying an insecticide or using an insecticide when they're planting corn, because it's not, I'll talk about this in a minute, it's not really an insecticide application. So it was very difficult for them to get good data on the prevalence of the use of these seed treatment insecticides. So they just quit asking those questions starting in 2015, though I suspect that the use would be just as high, if not higher, in the subsequent years. Very similar picture for thiamethoxam, sister of clothianidin, again used very widely in the Midwest. And in this case, it's used both on corn in yellow here and soybeans in green. Now, there are seed treatments that are not neonicotinoids. This product from DuPont, now Corteva, though I think this is owned by FMC, Lumivia, is a different chemistry, and this is used as a seed treatment. But the benefit of this one is that it has much, much lower toxicity to bees, and really may provide a way forward for continuing to be able to use seed treatments in corn with a product that has much lower intrinsic toxicity to bees and other pollinators. This was a study that was done by John Tooker at Penn State a few years back, and he made the conclusion, really in support of what I've just talked to you about, that really the majority of neonicotinoid use in this country, we've got millions of kilograms of neonicotinoids on the y-axis here, going through the years from 1995 up to 2014, again, when the data was no longer really available. The vast majority of the neonicotinoid use in this country is as a corn seed treatment in this dark red, or as a soybean seed treatment, which is really kind of astonishing that this market really drives the use of neonicotinoids in this country. If you're not talking about seed treatment, all other neonicotinoid uses really dwarf what's used as a seed treatment. So now seed treatments are kind of strange in that there is no label on those seed bags, because planting a treated seed is not technically a pesticide application. On most pesticides, of course, you'll have a label, and under the environmental hazard statement on that label, such as for bifenthrin 100 here, it will say, dangerous to bees, do not spray any plant in flower when bees are foraging. No such warning appears on seed to be planted, despite the fact that it contains these very high concentrations of these neonicotinoids, which do carry a substantial risk for bees if they encounter them. Instead, corn or any treated seed falls under the treated article provision under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. This is the same provisions that covers like treated lumber. So you don't get a pesticide label when you purchase treated lumber, because the treatment of that lumber, the use of the pesticide, actually occurred back at the lumber yard or the lumber mill, wherever that wood was treated with that pesticide. And after that point, it is considered a treated article and no longer needs to carry a label dictating how it can be used. So the label restrictions for seed treatments apply to the treatment of the seed in the seed treatment facility. And that's where an applicator would need to be sure to follow the label to make sure that that seed is treated in compliance with the instructions on the label. Once it's out of the seed treatment facility, it is now a treated article and no longer carries a label. So it doesn't really have any binding restrictions on how that seed can be handled or planted, because it is no longer a pesticide application. Unfortunately, while it's not a pesticide application, and bees certainly are not in the habit of going out there and digging up corn seeds, there is a release of insecticide to the environment when seeds are being planted. And it just takes a quick look at these seeds that we got in the lab to see how that might occur. I mean, these seeds are green, but you can see little flecks of this seed treatment have not been well adhered to the seed and are beginning to chip off and slough off those seeds. And it's this dust that falls off these seeds that can provide a route of exposure for bees to pick up these particles and potentially become poisoned through that exposure. In some extreme cases, we found some seeds that really had been very highly abraded and appeared to have very little seed treatment remaining on them. I don't know where all of this went, but I can assume that it was out into the environment somewhere. And if you, this is a scanning electron micrograph that we took of some of these corn seeds, and this down here is the surface of the corn seed. You can see one of the striations of the surface of the corn seed, and this is the seed treatment on top of it. And you can see how it's kind of blotchy, and it's very easy to see how some of these particles could easily get broken off and form a dust that bees could become exposed to. So the situation here is you've got seed being planted, and this could be a modern pneumatic planter, which uses air to move the seed from the hopper to being planted. And then that air is exhausted into the atmosphere and may carry some of this dust with it that chipped off of those seeds. And then that dust can be free to, bees can encounter it potentially in a number of ways in the environment. And there certainly have been reports of bee kills related to corn planting. This is an example from a beekeeper here in Ohio in 2016. He called me up and I went out to his apiary to take a look at the damage that was done during, this was in the early to mid-May. This looks just like a regular apiary. He probably has, about 50 colonies at this particular apiary. But if you look at the ground, you can see that there's really a kind of disturbing number of dead bees that were ejected from these colonies. And he was very certain that this was related to the corn planting that was going on in his area. We collected some of these bees and sent them off for pesticide residue analysis. And as you'd expect, it was clothianidin and thiamethoxam present in these bees, which indicates to me that it was a corn seed treatment dust event that caused this bee kill at this particular apiary. These bee poisoning incidents related to corn planting are not really new. They've been reported in Europe going back to 2008, where there was a really horrendous event where there was essentially a failure of the seed treatment. The seed treatment was falling off of the seeds, and there was widespread mortality of honeybee colonies in the area where these seeds were planted. But they've also been reported throughout Europe and in Canada. Indiana has seen a number of these events. It's not uncommon to see bee kills associated with corn planting throughout the areas where seed treatment insecticides are widely used. So I got involved back in 2013 when the Seed Corn Dust Research Consortium was assembled by the Pollinator Partnership. And this was a consortium of the pesticide manufacturers, the seed trade associations, the planter manufacturers, and the beekeepers, who all recognized that this poisoning of bees during planting was a serious concern. And they really wanted to get some research behind it to figure out, are there any mitigation measures? How can we reduce bee exposure to these seed treatment insecticides when corn is being planted? And so we did a 3-year project with them. I'm really going to show you the results from our final year, but really trying to get at that answer. How can we protect bees from the insecticides that are emitted during corn planting? And that was the goal: provide recommendations for reducing bee exposure to the seed treatment dust. Specifically, they were very interested in the use of seed lubricants in these pneumatic air-assisted planters to reduce the emission of dust. They want to know, were there any landscape modifications? Could weed control be used to reduce bee exposure to this insecticide? And are there any other recommendations that we could come up with to help reduce bee exposure? So for the dust drift issue, I worked with my colleague here at Ohio State, Harold Waters, who was in the Department of Extension. Harold is a corn and soybean farmer himself, and he advises corn and soybean farmers across the state. Well, he advised, he's now retired. Well, we set out these dust detectors that we used to measure the emission of the seed treatment insecticide downwind from the planters while they were being planted. And I say these dust detectors are really, I guess, not that high tech. What we've got here is these are microscope slides that have been smeared with tanglefoot, which is a sticky substance which will collect any dust that lands on them. We have some in a vertical orientation up at the top here and some in a horizontal orientation down below. And we set these up at various distances downwind from corn that was being planted. So we have them at right next to the planter, downwind 10 meters, 50 meters, and 100 meters. And we did this at 3 different locations as the planter planted a row of corn. We also put some of these dust detectors underneath the planter to see if any of this dust is dropped directly on the surface. This could be particularly important if weeds are a major source of exposure and a planter plants over weeds, and these could be exposed when they pick up that dust following planting. So then we took these dust detectors, extracted out the insecticide, and did pesticide residue analysis to determine the concentration of insecticide that was collected. So the first, Harold worked with a number of farmers with a variety of different planting equipment. And some of these farmers used their choice of seed lubricant, and that was either talc or a talc graphite blend, really a farmer's choice. And then we also provided them with some of this polyethylene-based fluency agent made available by Bayer, which was thought to reduce the emission of seed treatment dust if it was used, because this is a more slippery material and maybe could get the seeds to slide over each other better, reducing this abrasion that occurs as the seeds are moved and handled. But as you can see on the left here, we have the slides that were under the planter, under P here, and then moving downwind from the planter, next to the planter, 1 meter away, 10 meters away, 50 meters away, and 100 meters away. And you can see that the fluency agent really made no difference in the amount of seed treatment insecticide that was picked up by these dust detectors. No significant difference, whether you're using the fluency agent or the talc graphite that the farmers had traditionally been using in their planters. So kind of a disappointing result for the success of the fluency agent. Now, I do know that Bayer has results showing that this fluency agent works well under the conditions they used, but when we actually had growers use this, it did not appear to show the kind of benefit that's been previously reported. And just to put this in context, we calculated the US EPA's level of concern for foliar application of clothianidin, and that would be 0.7 nanograms per square centimeter. And you can see that going out to 50 meters downwind, these are all above EPA's level of concern and could result in bee mortality if bees were present, I guess, during corn planting. Harold also found that the dust emission was actually extremely variable between sites, and some sites had very high levels of dust emission, others had very low levels. It was kind of all over the map, and this wasn't related to the fluency agent, and it wasn't even related to the kind of planter that was being used. There's extreme variability in the emission based on planter types, because we've got some here like the 1770 NT. This is a pneumatic planter. In this case, it appeared that the fluency agent helped, but here we've got a non-air-assisted planter, the JD 7200, and the fluency agent didn't help in this situation, but we've just really got a lot of variability in the results that it's not really associated with any particular kind of planter. There just seems to be a lot of site-to-site variation that we couldn't really make sense of. So no clear recommendations from the fluency agent, apart from the fact that it doesn't appear to help the situation, and that farmers might be just as well off using the talc or graphite that they had been using previously. So I'm a honeybee guy. I do research on honeybees. So my lab worked on, what is the exposure and the effect of exposure to seed treatment dust. And we did this in central Ohio. This square here shows you these 10 locations. This is all just west of Columbus, which is right in the middle of the state here. And we worked with beekeepers in the area to get access to some sites in some really intensive corn and soybean growing areas. Additionally, we had one control site that was in the city of Columbus, this DS site, and this was in a very urban area right in the middle of Columbus and had essentially no corn or soybeans planted around that particular site. Because we're very interested in how the environment affects bee exposure to these seed treatment insecticides, we did a analysis of the landscape, characterizing the landscape at a 2-kilometer radius, which is approximately the foraging range for a honeybee colony. They will forage up to 2 kilometers, possibly further from their home to find the resources they need to support a growing colony. And we categorize this landscape into corn in yellow, soybeans in brown, forest in green, residential in pink, and a number of other landscape types surrounding these apiaries. So here's the land cover for all of the sites that we included in 2015. Yellow is the corn. And you can see that at the FSR site, we have almost 50% cornfields surrounding that apiary at a 2-kilometer radius. Going down to our control site here, this is the one, DS is in Columbus. And as you'd expect, it has mostly residential area around it in pink. So those are the sites. And then we collected data from these apiaries. We collected dead bees using these drop zone dead bee traps. And these are essentially boxes with half-inch hardware cloth on the top so that dead bees will fall through this and can be collected. It has a window screen on the bottom so that the ants can't carry the dead bees away. And we can count the number of dead bees produced by each of these colonies every 3 to 4 days during the corn planting season. And just to show you results from those dead bee traps, and now I'm going back to our first study in 2013, we do need to standardize these dead bee trap results because a larger colony produces more dead bees just naturally because there are more bees dead in a large colony. So we standardized it to a mortality index here on the y-axis. And then we asked the question, are there more dead bees during the corn planting period than outside the corn planting period? So we collected dead bees before, during, and several weeks after corn planting. And in 2013, that answer was yes. There were more dead bees when corn was being planted than when corn was not being planted. And we saw a very similar trend in 2014 and 2015. Always, there were more dead bees produced by these colonies when corn was being planted than before or after corn planting. But is it seed treatment insecticides that are potentially causing this mortality? To answer that question, as well as to answer the question about what bees are foraging on in these environments, we used pollen traps. And these are standard Sundance mounted, bottom mounted pollen traps. It goes underneath the colony. And there's a series of screens in here so that when a bee returns to the colony, it has to navigate this series of screens, and the pollen balls that are on the bee's leg get scraped off and land in this drawer. And then we just come along every 3 or 4 days and empty out the pollen that's been collected in this drawer for pesticide residue analysis. And we can also do pollen analysis to figure out which plants are associated with the pollen the bees are collecting. You can actually collect a huge amount of pollen using these bottom-mounted Sundance traps. In some cases, kilograms of pollen. You can actually starve a colony of pollen. They are so effective. So here we've got the pesticide residue analysis results for all 3 years. And we have clothianidin and thiamethoxam on the y-axis here. And this is summed together, both outside the corn planting period and during the corn planting period. And again, we've got significantly higher corn insecticide concentrations in the pollen during corn planting than before or after corn planting in 2013, in 2014, and in 2015. These insecticides have they have no other use in the environment during this period. So these could only come from corn corn that's being planted, or potentially soybeans that are being planted in the case of thiamethoxam. So the bees are exposed, and this is producing a increase in dead bees. But then the question that I guess is really interested for the CDRC project is, how are bees being exposed to this seed treatment dust? And Doug and others in the lab came up with a number of hypotheses about how bees are exposed to the seed treatment dust. Number one, if there are weeds in the field and this dust settles on those weeds in the field, it could be from infield weed exposure. It could be from the dust settling on the weeds and other plants neighboring fields, such as these dandelions here, and they could pick that up while foraging in that area. It could also be aerial exposure, and not through collection of floral resources. It could be through flying through the plume, because bees carry an electrostatic charge, and bees are experts and need to collect dust. That dust is the pollen that they use to feed themselves and to feed their young. So they will pick up the dust as they fly through a plume downwind from a planter. So it could be that it's this plume during a planting event that's causing bee exposure. Or perhaps most depressingly, it could be that there's just a cloud of seed treatment dust over the entire Midwest as corn is being planted each spring, and it's this diffuse cloud of dust, and that no matter where the bees are flying, they're going to encounter these very small particles of insecticide and pick that up, resulting in those concentrations in pollen and that bee kill, mild bee kill that was observed. So to answer these questions, we did some in-depth characterization of the landscapes and how bees were foraging in those landscapes. First off, we drove around at all these sites and characterized the amount of infield bloom that we observed. And this is cases where the farmer had not applied an herbicide to burn down the weeds present in the fields. And this is pretty variable. Some fields had relatively abundant blooming weeds in the fields. Many had none because an herbicide had been applied, but we measured that and put that on the map for these foraging areas around each of the apiaries. And you can see these are all characterized in this bar chart here. Some contained large amounts of infield blooms, some contained relatively little. And that pollen that we collected with those pollen traps, we did microscopic analysis of that pollen to figure out which plants the bees were collecting pollen from. And so here on the left are just some pictures of, this is an aster pollen. Down here is a legume pollen. And with some practice, you can identify the different plant species that are in the pollen that the bees are collecting. And then on the right here is just kind of a summary chart showing a bee's diet over this week and a half, 2-week period that corn is being planted in Ohio. And it's kind of an astonishing array of different foods these bees are eating. Though this pink in the middle, the rosaceae, this is the fruit trees and related shrubs that appear to be a bee favorite, as well as the dandelions that you might expect. If we break that down, it's actually kind of astonishing that bees during this period are primarily foraging on trees and shrubs. And of the 4 sites I've got listed here, 71% of their foraging, of the pollen that they collected, was actually from trees or shrubs. And that's the fruit trees, ash, willow, and other trees. A smaller component of their diet was from the herbaceous plants that would be growing in the fields or on the roadsides as dandelions or mustards or mints. Just 28% of their pollen diet came from those herbaceous plants. So this underscores that trees and shrubs are really underappreciated for the support they provide for bees and other pollinators, and that I think they've been kind of neglected when we're talking about pollinator plantings. We also, and this is probably the most fun part of the whole project, is we set up observation hives at 4 of these sites. And an observation hive is just a glass-walled hive where you can actually see the bee activity inside the colony. And we put these observation hives in these garbage can sheds to protect them from the elements while they were out there. And the reason we wanted observation hives is so that we could record with a video camera the bee activity on this bottom frame, so that we could look at the waggle dance activity that was occurring there. Now, honeybees have this amazing ability to communicate with each other through this waggle dance. This was discovered by Carl von Frisch. He shared the Nobel Prize for this discovery back in the early 1970s. And what the bees do when they go out and forage and found a really nice patch of flowers, that forager will come back and will dance on the surface of the comb and communicate with her sisters, her nestmates, the location of that nice patch of flowers. And she can communicate the angle that those bees need to fly to find this patch of flowers, as well as the distance that they need to travel to find that forage, all through this figure-8 waggle dance that she's doing on the surface of the comb. Now, the bees are there interpreting this dance, and they'll go out and try to find that patch of flowers. But because we've got a video camera here and are recording these dances, we can actually decode the bees' dances and kind of eavesdrop on the patches of flowers that they are recruiting to. And we can then put that on a map and find out which components of the landscape are bees recruiting to. Well, first off, we can find out how far the bees are foraging because the distance is encoded in this dance. And we found that this is, of all the dances that we decoded, we found that about 50% of them are within about a kilometer, just over a kilometer. 50% of the foraging is occurring, and 95% of the foraging is occurring within 300 or 3,000 meters or 3 kilometers, which is, I guess, validates our interest in the landscape at this 2-kilometer radius. And then we can overlay the bee recruitment maps based on this dance analysis, and we can see where the bees are recruiting in these different landscapes. And it turns out they are really recruiting to non-agricultural areas. These pastures, tree lines. They do not appear to be recruiting to fields that have weeds in them. So that kind of, I guess, indicates to us that these weeds in fields may not be a major source of exposure to the seed treatment dust because the bees just are not attracted to those infield weeds. At least they're not recruiting other bees to the infield weeds as reported through the waggle dance and our analysis of the waggle dance. So then we also broke down the landscape and kind of weighted the different landscape components, the cornfields, the weedy fields, the tree lines, the other components of the landscape, and then weighted them relative to their proximity to cornfields where planting was occurring and relative to their proximity to the apiary at the middle of these circles to try to answer these hypotheses that I put up here just a moment ago. And so here are these hypotheses that the main routes of exposure to seed treatment dust is through floral contamination or aerial exposure, just flying through the air, and that it's infield weeds or that it's off-field weeds and that it's this drift onto those dandelions neighboring the fields, or that it's a discrete plume of dust, or that it's this diffuse cloud hypothesis that there's just a cloud of neonicotinoid dust throughout the Midwest during corn planting. Well, Doug, who I mentioned earlier, did some in-depth statistical analysis of our results, and he was able to rule out infield weeds, neighboring weeds, and this discrete plume hypothesis. And what we're left with explaining bee exposure to these neonicotinoid insecticides is it's just a cloud of insecticide over these corn planting areas. This was the only significant relationship that we found in the data that we collected, is that the more corn that's around an apiary, the greater the concentration of these neonicotinoid insecticides that are present in the pollen. And this indicates that it's just a big cloud of planter dust over these areas when corn is being planted, and that you can't really, none of these mitigation measures, managing infield weeds or other things, is going to help. So really the only mitigation approaches that this analysis supports is either reduction in the use of the insecticidal seed treatments or improving the adherence of the seed treatment insecticide to those seeds. Anything related to the landscape management is not likely to be beneficial and to mitigate the exposure of these insecticides to bees. So that's, I guess, kind of a lot of work to find a relatively uninspiring result, I'll admit. But we also were interested in, we have these bees that are exposed to these seed treatment insecticides. What's the effect on the colony development? So we followed these colonies throughout the season, before planting, after planting, and through the next year to look to see how they overwintered. And we did in-depth analyses. We cataloged all of the different types of cells that were in these colonies, collected bee bread, nurse bees for pesticide residue analysis. And we looked at the long-term effects of this seed treatment dust exposure on these colonies that were exposed. And we looked in April to May, and this is the period when corn planting is occurring. And we found no significant relationship between insecticide exposure and the number of bees, the amount of pollen, the amount of nectar, the amount of capped brood. It appeared to have no correlation with the strength of these colonies. And longer term, the results get even weirder. In May to June, we found that the adult population was actually positively correlated with insecticide exposure. And in June to August, we found increased pollen and nectar stores in colonies that had more cornfields around them. And 31 of 34 colonies survived the winter. We saw no significant correlation between the survival and insecticide concentration in the pollen that had been collected from these colonies. So what's going on here? We have positive correlation with insecticide exposure. Is somehow are these neonicotinoids good for bees? Well, I don't think that's a plausible explanation. I think what's going on here is that agricultural environments are good for bees, just as I told you at the very beginning of this talk. And I think what's going on here is that areas that have more corn area around them, and bees are exposed to more seed treatment insecticides, these are also areas where more soybean is grown, because of course we have the corn-soybean rotation. And it turns out, and this is work we're doing in the lab right now, soybeans can be a substantial source of nectar for honeybee colonies. And I think this may explain why bees may do well in agricultural environments, because they have access to the abundant soybean nectar, which is kind of the other side of the coin for corn. So I think this is the explanation, not that the neonicotinoids are somehow good. It's just that the corn-rich environments are good for bees. So the conclusions from this were that small bee kills are consistently associated with corn planting, and bees are exposed to these seed treatment insecticides during corn planting. More corn equals more insecticide exposure, but more corn, at least in Ohio, equals better foraging environments for the rest of the season. And this is all summarized in the scientific paper that we published in the Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, and is present in that final report. And yeah, there are apparently no long-term effects on the colonies, despite the fact that there were clearly increased number of dead bees right around corn planting. So how does this relate to recommendations for mitigation? It's a little anticlimactic. I will agree with you. And I really like I guess I like the seed treatment stewardship guide from the American Seed Trade Association. They essentially summarize the Corn Seed Treatment Dust Consortium's recommendations, and they summarize it for farmers and for applicators. But I think the most important recommendations are for applicators, and I especially like this recommendation right here. Establish written application protocols using best practices to ensure high-quality seed treatment applications to minimize dust-off. Now, it's interesting. I have not heard a lot of complaints from beekeepers really since 2016 related to bee kills around corn planting. This was a major issue from about 2012 through 2016, but has largely gone away more recently. I don't want to say that bee kills do not occur, but I think the level of bee mortality has fallen to a level where beekeepers no longer notice it. And I think a lot of that improvement is related to improved sticking of the seed treatment to the seed. And I think it's very important that the people actually doing the application to the seed at these insecticide or these seed treatment facilities pay attention to these best management practices to make sure that the seed treatment stays on the seed. And honestly, I think this is really the only recommendation that's really of a lot of value here. and something that we really need to take out to the pesticide applicators to make sure that the seed treatment stays on the seed. For farmers, I don't really agree with many of these recommendations. I mean, I think you should always follow the directions on for handling and labeling to try to minimize, obvious dust exposure to honeybee colonies. But in our study, it's nothing that any particular farmer is doing. It's just the dust that's up there in the atmosphere that is driving bee exposure. And we just need to reduce the amount of dust that's emitted on a broader scale rather than anything any particular farmer is doing related to bees in the area, which is not doesn't lead to clear recommendations for a farmer other than to possibly not use treated seeds if they can get away with it. Which raises the question, are insecticide seed treatments really required? And I know this is a bit of a hot topic, but there have been papers published by my colleagues at other universities really challenging the need for these insecticide seed treatments on soybeans and on corn. I think the case is much clearer in soybean, where these seed treatments really provide essentially no benefit for the farmers, but there are publications out there showing that they really have relatively little value for corn as well. These are from colleagues at Purdue and at Penn State, really challenging the widespread universal use of these seed treatment insecticides. The one case where I think seed treatment insecticides do provide an obvious value for corn is in control of seed corn maggot. And my retired colleague, Ron Hammond, he really thought these were very valuable for control of this pest in particular. And it's obvious how they could control this pest, because this is a pest of the corn seed. And this particular fly larva cannot eat the seed if it's poisoned by the seed treatment insecticide that's surrounding the corn seed. And so seed treatment insecticides can be very highly effective against this particular pest, but they have relatively low value against all other pests aside from the seed corn maggot. And a farmer can often know which sites are going to be susceptible to seed corn maggot if it's a cover crop that they're plowing under, or another environment where seed corn maggots are likely to be an issue. In that case, seed treatment insecticide is likely justified, but those are relatively small, rare situations. And honestly, I think the seed treatments insecticides are really vastly overused. So one model for reducing seed treatment insecticide use has been taken up in Ontario in Canada, where they actually have a requirement for scouting and an IPM approach to allow a farmer to purchase neonicotinoid treated seed for planting. They need to demonstrate that there's actually a problem that will be solved by the use of these seed treatment insecticides. And this could provide a model for how we reduce seed treatment insecticide use in the United States. So in conclusion, overall, I want to just stress that agricultural areas really are a good place to keep bees here in Ohio, and likely in other areas where corn and soybeans are grown. These seed treatments on corn and soybean really do represent most of the neonicotinoid insecticide use in the United States. But this use does carry risk for pollinators. Now, it's low in many situations and is likely low in the current environment, relatively low bee mortality, but it does occur, and this is definitely harming pollinators in some situations. Weigh that against the 0 to low benefit of insecticide use in this way for farmers, and it gets to be a little more complex equation. The seed lubricants, weed control, and beekeeping practices are really unlikely to mitigate the seed treatment insecticide risk to bees. So the recommendations, I think, really need to be focused at the seed treatment applicators to make sure that the protocols are followed to ensure that the insecticide is well adhered to the seed, and farmers can consider planting a seed without insecticide in areas where it's unlikely to provide a benefit. And I just want to thank all the members of the lab throughout the years, particularly Doug Sponsler and Chia Lin, who really led up this project, as well as the Pollinator Partnership for leading the CDRC, the Corn Seed Treatment Dust Research Consortium, US EPA, which provided some funding for 2015, as well as the Ohio State Beekeepers Association. And at this point, I'm happy to answer questions.
Great. Thanks, Reed. That was great. Yeah. That was wonderful information. Um, Perfect for exactly what we need to know right now. And oh, I do see a question. If the farmers in Ontario need to document an issue to use treatment, does that mean untreated seed is more readily available in Canada? That's a problem here, is actually access
Yeah,
to.
and I hear that from a lot of people that it's very difficult to find untreated seed. I would assume I honestly don't know anything. I'm not a corn farmer, and I'm certainly not a corn farmer in Ontario, so I don't have a good answer to that question. But I assume it must be more available if the I think they're trying to make it so the default is to plant untreated seed. But if you have a justification for use of a seed treatment, then you can go through that process to justify your use. So I think that's where we need to get is that the untreated seed is the default, or lack of insecticide in that seed treatment is the default, and you need to justify use of it.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm going to put up the QR code for people's CCA credits if you need those. And you have a few more minutes left if folks have questions. Go back to the chat. Is there current research on dust off impacts using current seed treatment protocols?
Not that I know of. I suspect there may be some research that's been done by the pesticide companies demonstrating that, but they have not shared that publicly. I mean, I think they've got a. I don't hear anywhere close to the number of complaints from beekeepers. So I think they have largely mitigated the problem through improved, maybe through formulation of that seed treatment or through stressing the application protocols. I wish they'd share more information about that. We were trying to do a project on this in 2019 through 2021, but that project really got derailed by COVID, and unfortunately, the results are not. It did not appear that bees were exposed to the levels of insecticide that they were back in 2013 to 2015, but unfortunately, that project really never kind of died on the vine with the restrictions of COVID.
Yeah, it's funny. Once COVID hit, the research seems really strong until that point, and then all of a sudden, there's like nothing else. Um, Interesting. So, well, I don't see any more questions. We still have another minute if folks have any further questions. Otherwise, Reed, this was great. I think really helpful. And also something we need to continue to look at is if there have been improvements, and if we can capture those through new research here in the Northeast, that would probably be really great and help us too as we're navigating this situation at this point.
I agree. It would be great to do a follow up and see how things are today, particularly in the Northeast. Yeah.
Well, if you're looking for any collaborators, Reed, we're ready to dive in. Great. Well, thank you again. Oh, are weeds along fields taking up neonics?
So there has been a study showing that weeds along the margins do, because of course these are water soluble and can be present in low concentration in the nectar and pollen produced by, the roadside weeds. I don't know if the concentration would be high enough to cause anything but a very low level sublethal effect in bees, because the concentration is quite low by that point, but they are detectable.
Great. And have you ever looked at water sources?
Oh, water sources.
Honeybees, yeah, collect for hive temperature regulation and anyway, anything
No,
there?
we never have looked at water sources, but I think that's a really interesting question. And I think the water question, I mean, these could well be having effects on a number of other pollinators or even other invertebrates that live in the water. Because all of these, millions of kilograms of neonicotinoid have to go somewhere, and it's almost certainly into the water at some point. So I think that's a really good question, but we have not done any work on that.
Great. Lots more to do then. Never
Yeah,
a dull
no
moment.
shortage.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Thank you so much, Reed. Happy holidays to you and your family. And I'm sure we'll be keeping in touch. You'll probably hear from us again. And to everyone else on the webinar series, I hope to see you tomorrow so we can chat more with folks, answer more questions, get feedback and suggestions. So thank you. Thank you, Reed. Have a great
Thanks.
day. All right. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.